Welcome back. This is the third lecture in the series on the Canonical Parables. The question is still with us. Were Jesus' parables actually allegories, short stories intending to be interpreted allegorically? Well, once again, biblical historians will say absolutely not. But they say this for a different reason, and it has to do with how parables work. And this is just a fundamental thing I want you to be sure to hold on to. For them to work, first of all, they're teaching devices. There's no question about this. Parables are not for entertainment purposes, although there may be some that could be quite entertaining. But their purpose is to teach something. And so, for them to teach something, they have to work. They have to be effective at their teaching, for parables to work as teaching devices, according to one big school of thought, the imagery in the parable has got to be something that the audience or the reader, in our case, can understand. If there's going to be a comparison, for example, if this is an allegory, therefore meant to be interpreted allegorically. The comparison, that it needs to be clear to the audience that it's got to make sense that A stands for B, that the prodigal son would represent the runaways, according to Billy Graham. I mean, those have to make some sense to them. And one of the big arguments, and it certainly was a big argument when I was sitting in your seats, and in many ways I think continues today, is does the imagery have to be realistic for it to make sense to an audience? Well, Joachim Jeremias, whose name I didn't put on here, in fact, I can go ahead and put it up here right now. Was one of the very famous interpreters of the parables. He said absolutely not. The parables of Jesus, the true parables of Jesus, had to use realistic imagery, or otherwise their peasant population who's listening to these stories wouldn't make sense. But there are an awful lot of scholars, as you're going to see, for good reason, think, allegories can make sense. Even though the imagery may not be realistic, as long as the comparisons work, as long as what A is representing, if it makes sense that A would represent B. It makes sense that, again, using Billy Graham's example, that the younger brother represents the runaways of today. And it certainly does make sense, at least in my interpretation of Dr. Graham's interpretation there. Okay. All right. Anyway, remember that audience, and this is important regardless of whether we think these are allegories or not. It's got to make sense to Jesus's audience, and this is one of the questions that we ought to be entertaining when we're analyzing a parable. Does this look like a story that the fishermen and peasants and essentially illiterate women at the time, most of them who would have been hearing this would not have been very intelligent, although some certainly were. Mary Magdalene certainly was among those. But most of the women and most of the people hearing these things would not have had an education. So, Jesus certainly would have used parables that would have made sense to the audience he was addressing. Now, sometimes he was addressing the Pharisees. And there he could use some pretty highfalutin types of imagery in order for the parable to do its job. But we got to be careful about that. If the parable looks like it's much too sophisticated and maybe even outside of Palestinian sophistication at the time of Jesus, we've got to question this parable might be something actually created by the early church and not by Jesus. Fortunately, there are not too many that fall into that category. All right, so the next question about this too is, did Jesus interpret, even if his parables weren't allegories, did he interpret them allegorically? That's a historical question. And again, historians of the Bible say no. But a good number of people Actually, the historians of the Bible believe that indeed the allegorical interpretations, as I said earlier, like the allegorical interpretation of the parable of the sower, were the work of the early church and their explanation of what they thought Jesus meant by the parable of the sower. And as you can see, we've got some slight differences in the way that that parable is told and also how it's interpreted allegorically, which again points probably to the activity of the early church rather than to Jesus being inconsistent in the interpretation of his own parables, which frankly wouldn't make much sense to me. Of course, the other answer to the question of whether Jesus interpreted parables allegorically is, of course, yes. I mean, since the New Testament describes Jesus doing this, he must have done it. And that's it's a reasonable type of conclusion, though a little bit outside of historical analysis itself. All right. So we're still stuck a bit on the nature of allegory and about the nature of the parables. What we're going to do is we're going to keep moving on, realizing that we haven't solved the problem. Are they meant to be allegories? I think probably from my perspective, the simplest way of addressing this problem is almost to set the problem aside and then deal with the basic nature of a parable, and then maybe that'll help us answer the question of whether they really are allegories or whether they are meant to be interpreted allegorically. All right, for this again, we need to go back to Mr. Aristotle, who said the parables were, again, one type of example or illustration. But he goes on in his book called Rhetoré, the Rhetoric, to define parables as stories and sayings which try to make a point using comparison to do so. I've got that right there. I don't believe those are his words. I think that's my summary of his words. But again, parables are stories and sayings that use comparisons. So they've got to use comparisons or they're not parables. Okay. And he goes on to describe all kinds of different comparison forms and different types of metaphors that we mentioned before. Anyway, that's what Aristotle says about them. Now, before going to the New Testament more specifically, we need to stop and look at the Old Testament, because remember, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, was essentially the Bible of Jesus and the earliest church before the Gospels and other things were finally written and collected and distributed. There is this word I mentioned earlier, mashal or maskal in Hebrew, and this word is used. It's translated as a parable. But wow, it means a lot of different things. And here, some of this ought to sound familiar to you, because I'm turning to some of the work, the insights by Dr. Crossan. A good example of a type of mashal that is proverbial is in Ezekiel, verses 43 through 45 of chapter 16. Have you not committed lewdness beyond all your abominations? Ezekiel says, see, everyone who uses proverbs, now notice this is the word mashal, and sometimes it's translated proverbs, sometimes it's translated as parable. Everyone who uses proverbs will use this proverb about you, like mother, like daughter. You wonder where that came from, like father, like son, and such? Well, here we go. I don't know if anybody used it before Ezekiel, but he's the first one I know of who actually used that term. So, anyway, he calls this like mother, like daughter, he calls that a mashal. And he goes on and says, you're the daughter of your mother who loathed her husband. And he goes on and interprets this a little bit different. Anyway, so in this, again, just focus and don't get too caught up in these the niceties here. The basic point here is that here is a similitude. It uses like. Someone's like their mother. The daughter is like the mother. A basic proverb, basic type of bit of wisdom, simple bit of wisdom. According to Professor Crossan, this is a type of parable, the proverbial parable, the proverbial mashal. Now, good old Ezekiel, who was just loaded with stuff, and oh man, it'd take more than a semester to unpack that fascinating prophet's work. He also uses mashal to describe allegory, what we would call an allegory. And he actually, in this case, it is translated, mashal is translated as allegory. Now, for those of you who have had Old Testament introduction, you ought to recognize something here in verse 2, where Ezekiel says, chapter 17, verse 2, O mortal, propound a riddle, that means speak a riddle, and speak an allegory to the house of Israel. This is a good example of synonymous parallelism, where allegory and riddle are used in exchange for each other. I'm pretty sure, though, that the word allegory here is mashal. So notice here Ezekiel thinks of mashal as some kind of a riddle. It's something that needs to be solved. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I do want you to look at this passage. It's dynamite. Anyway, here's the allegory. A great eagle with great wings and long pinions, rich in plumage of many colors, came to the Lebanon. And he took the top of the cedar, broke off its topmost shoot, carried it to a land of trade, set it in a city of merchants. And he took a seed from the land. He placed it in fertile soil, a plant by abundant waters. He set it like a willow twig. And it sprouted, became a vine, spreading out, but lo, its branches turned toward him. Its roots remained where it stood. So it became a vine, and it brought forth branches. It put forth foliage. And then another eagle shows up. Now, we keep going down here, and let's see. And actually, in the following verses here, now when we get down into verse 11, Ezekiel translates the parable, the allegory, for you. He tells us what it represents. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Tell them. Well, the king of Babylon, that's the eagle, came to Jerusalem. And he took its king and its officials, brought them back with him to Babylon. And he took one of the royal offspring and made a covenant with it. And you just go back and he takes all of the main characters in this story and treats them as symbols of something else. Okay. Another classic allegory in the Old Testament is the story of Nathan's parable in 2 Samuel. And if you know the story already, we don't need to go back over it, but this is a turning point in, in this story, the prophet Nathan gets David to realize his own sin in having committed adultery, fornication, and actually he's caused a woman to create Bathsheba to commit adultery. He has fornicated, and he has also set up a man for being killed, and Uriah, and he essentially had him murdered. And a classic example here, and he tells David, as the Lord lives, the man in this story who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore, David says this to Nathan. And actually, after this, Nathan says, well, David, you're the man in this story. You are the one, the rich man who had flocks and herds and took something away from the poor man. So classic allegory, intended as allegory. It's called a mashal. So parables, allegories had a rich history in the Old Testament. Okay, now we're at 13 minutes and 40 seconds here. I'm going to stop right here. It's a good breaking point before we go on more specifically now and drill down further in the parables of the New Testament.